Hi Year 5, it is Tuesday, so it is another chapter of Tom's Midnight Garden, and we are actually up to chapter 24, which is Brothers Meet. Peter Long slept only a little that Thursday night before he woke himself in dissatisfaction. His dreaming was all wrong. Night after night he had managed to dream that he was with Tom. He had been able to dream of the garden as Tom described it in his letters. Tonight, when his ignorance of Tom's plans made him yearn all the more to imagine what he might be doing. Tonight he could not dream of the garden at all. Instead, he had begun dreaming of all tall grey shape that rode like an anchored ship into the surrounding level. He did not know what he was seeing until his eyes opened from sleep and fell at once upon the Ely postcard, still dimly visible on the mantelpiece by the light of the street. Peter closed his eyes again to shut out the sight of the cathedral tower. He concentrated his thoughts upon what Tom might be doing at this very moment, and at the same time he began to count, in order to send himself off to sleep. He did not count the usual sheep going through a stile, because there are neither sheep nor stiles in a garden. He simply counted. Numbers in their regularity began to send Peter to sleep. He had a drowsy feeling that he was earnestly seeking for Tom, and that pleased him. Surely he would see the garden soon. He had only to follow Tom. He was really asleep now, but even in his sleep he went on counting, and the numbers now began to be numbers of something particular. The garden was still not reached, and these were numbers of steps that he was counting. Steps upward, winding inside a grey tower that even in his dream he perceived with annoyance to be the cathedral tower of Ely once again. There are nearly 300 steps up to the top of the tower of Ely Cathedral, or, to be exact, 286. At least that is what Tom made them, counting as he climbed. He was at the end of the file of sightseers, Hattie just before him. They came stooping out at last through a little door onto the leads of the tower roof. Now nothing was higher. They looked over the parapet and saw the roof of the great nave below them. They saw far down over the housetops of Ely, and saw the black holes of chimney pots through which mounted the smoke of winter fires. The lines of smoke were beginning to bend slightly out of the upright as the wind got up a little. The breath of this wind and the puffing of a train in Ely station was all the sound that reached them. They saw the town, and at once beyond it, for Ely is very small. They saw the river bounding the town on one side, and they looked along it downstream. They saw the whiteness of the iceway, gleaming where the sunset touched it, and winding and disappearing into distant mists and evening, in that direction of Littleport, Denver, King's Lynn, and the sea. Then they looked back along the way they had come, from Castleford. They were awed at the distance of it. The tower keeper pointed to something far away that he declared were the spires of Castleford. Then he drew his sightseeing party aside to peer in another direction, towards Peterborough. Hattie went with the others. Tom remained where he was, still staring towards Castleford. He was alone on that side of the leads for a moment, and then he had a strong feeling that he was not alone after all. Someone had come belatedly out through the door from the spiral staircase and now stood beside him. He knew, even before he turned, that it was Peter. From the other side of the leads, Hattie looked round to see where Tom had got to. She saw, instead of one boy, two. They were very much alike and dressed identically in pyjamas. The second boy had the same insubstantial look that she had surely noticed recently in Tom himself. She was almost sure that she could see the tower parapet through both of them. She stared in wonderment. "But, Tom, where's the garden?" Peter was saying rather querulously. "I thought you were with Hattie in the garden." Tom answered directly, because he felt in his bones that time was short, and shortening. "The garden's back there," he said briefly, flinging his arms outward in the direction of Castleford. "And Hattie's here." "Where? Can I see her?" said Peter. Tom was pointing with his finger, and Peter was facing Hattie across the leads. She was the only one among the sightseers who had turned in his direction. "There," said Tom, "right opposite you, the one carrying skates." "But that," said Peter indignantly, "that's not Hattie. That's a grown-up woman." Tom, staring at Hattie as though he was seeing her for the first time, opened his mouth to speak, but he could not. "Time," called the tower keeper. "Time to go down again, if you please, ladies and gentlemen." The little crowd of sightseers began to cluster round the doorway to the spiral staircase. One by one they began to go through it. Only Hattie remained where she was, and the two boys. "But she's grown up," Peter said again. Hattie began to come across to them, and Tom felt Peter shrinking away from her. "Who was he? What was he?" Hattie breathed to Tom, and Tom again, without looking, knew that Peter had vanished from his side, thinned out and vanished. "He was like you," Hattie whispered, "and he was unreal looking, just like you." "Come along, lady," called the tower keeper, and looked at Hattie curiously, thinking she was young, and too young to be queer in the head, and muttering to herself. "He was my brother, Peter," Tom stammered. "But he's real, Hattie. He's real, like me. You agreed I was real, Hattie." "Don't you want to get home at all tonight, young miss?" the keeper was asking impatiently. Hattie heard him and looked up and round her. Suddenly, the sun had set. In the town, yellow lights were springing up in all the windows. Beyond the town, the fen level was one shadowy expanse, so that one could no longer see the winding of the river. "It's late," she cried in fright. "Yes, we must hurry." "We?" said the keeper. "It's you should hurry. Here, I've been waiting for you." Hattie, however, now started down the staircase in great haste, with Tom at her heels, and the keeper was left to grumble to himself and look up and come after them. Inside the tower, it was as black as if night had already descended. Tom felt that the darkness increased Hattie's anxiety for the homeward journey. The hurry and the fear behind it prevented Tom from thinking coolly about the strange meeting above, and about what he had said then. He wondered confusedly how Peter had come to them, and whether he could come again. That did not happen. Peter Long, at home, had woken up from his dream, a bad dream, if not quite a nightmare. He lay in bed remembering it, but only in seemingly unconnected parts. He had been counting to send himself to sleep, and he remembered getting as far as 286. Then he had been at some great height, where he had not wanted to be, and the garden was impossibly far away. Tom had been there too, somehow, and he remembered Tom pointing someone out to him and saying that it was Hattie, and his own crying out that it couldn't be Hattie, because this was a grown-up young woman, and not a child at all. He remembered then the look on Tom's face, a strange dawning amazement and fear. Tom and Hattie hurried from the cathedral and went down to the river again, just where most of the Ely skaters were beginning to come off it. They were the only two, it seemed, who were starting to skate. 3 old men, past skating themselves, were leaning on convenient posts along the waterfront, watching all that was going on. They considered themselves of the age and experience to give Hattie advice. One asked where she was skating to at that time of evening, and when she said Castleford, they all 3 of them shook their heads. "If the ice folds," said one, "but this old southwest wind means rain and thaw likely." The breeze that Tom and Hattie had noticed from the top of the tower had by now strengthened into a real wind. It felt softer and milder, even in Tom's face, than the former frosty stillness. "There's already someone went through, I heard," said the second old man. "Somewhere upstream it was. He didn't drown, though. They were friends with him, and they got him out just in time. With a ladder over the ice. There'll be a hole left, and brought an ice around it. You best keep a lookout for it." "Now, where did you say it was, Matthew?" The first old man did not know, but the third one thought the hole must be a biggish one, and that Hattie was to be sure notice it when she got really close. She must not forget to be careful, too, of treacherous ice under bridges and trees, and along reed beds. The first old man started the round again by saying that Hattie would do better to go from train to Ely to Castleford. Hattie thanked them all, but went on fastening her skate straps. Tom thought she was rather brave. They stood up together on the ice, and Hattie wished the old men a cheerful good night, and they earnestly wished her the best of luck. And one of them shouted after her that at least she would have a full moon. When they skated out of earshot, Harry told Tom that she had not had enough money to take the train all the way from Ely to Castleford. They were skating out against a stream of homecomers, but soon they passed the last of them and were skating alone. Tom knew that this was the time to talk to Hattie, and yet clearly she was disinclined for any conversation. All her powers were being put forth into her skating. Tom stole sideways glances at her as she went, weighing in his mind what Peter had said. He did not speak to her. The moon rose full, as the old man had said. It had a halo to it, which supposed meant rain. The moonlight laid open their way before them, and yet made it appear more desolate. That means empty. And themselves more lonely. Except for the wind and the sound of steel on ice, there was silence. Neither Hattie nor Tom liked the silence, but neither broke it. In silence, moonlight and loneliness, they were gliding onwards. Some way ahead, on the riverbank to their right, they noticed an upright, dark shape, perhaps 6 feet high. It was certainly a post or a tree trunk, and they were paying no particular attention to it. Then, suddenly, they saw it move. Hattie gave a little gasp, never stopped skating. It was almost as if she could not. At this curve of the river, she was skating full into the moonlight, but the man, for it was a man, was black against it and seemed unnaturally tall. He seemed to be watching something intently, and Tom felt that he was watching them. They were nearer now. They would be level soon. The figure on the bank stirred again and called over the ice a name that was between a question and a hail. "Miss Hattie?" Tom felt himself fall out of stroke with Hattie as she wavered in her course. "Who is it?" she called, but Tom thought she recognised the voice, although he did not. Her strokes were beginning to shorten. Her course was curving towards the bank. "It's me, young Barty." "Oh, Barty, I am glad to see you," cried Hattie, forgetting shyness in her relief. He came down to the edge of the bank, a well-set young man in a caped overcoat, wearing farmer's gaiters. "But where are you off to, all alone at this time of evening, on this ice?" "To Castleford. From here I can take the train or walk home. I must get home." "As to getting home, why yes," agreed young Barty, "but you shouldn't be skating alone like this. I'd best give you a lift." It seemed that he had been on his way home from Castleford Market in his gig. He had turned aside down a droveway to have a look at the river and the condition of the ice. That was when Hattie and Tom had seen him. Delightfully, the horse and gig, although invisible from the river, were only a few yards away, on the other side of the river embankment. When young Barty had helped Hattie up his embankment, they saw the horse waiting between the shafts, lit by yellow flames of the headlamps, the first warm-coloured light they had seen since candlelight and lamplight in the house windows on Ely. Beyond the gig, the droveway stretched back to the street to meet the main road of Castleford and home. They all got into the gig, young Barty and Hattie at either end of the front seat, with a large space in the middle, which looked just right for Tom himself. "I'll drive you to Waterbeach," said young Barty. "You can take a train from there to Castleford. If you'll excuse the question, have you got enough money for the ticket? If not, I could lend you some." "That's very kind of you," Hattie said primly, then she added, "I feared that I'd take you out of your way." She certainly was not taking him out of the way he had been going, which was home to one of his father's farms out in the fens. Yet without exactly telling an untruth, young Barty gave Hattie to understand that all this was a pleasure. After that they drove in silence. When they reached Waterbeach, they found that the last train to Castleford had already gone. "I'll drive you to Castleford then," said young Barty, and sounded quite cheerful about it. So they went on again, and Tom noticed that this time the other two made more conversation. They remarked upon the weather and their journey, Hattie speaking at first awkwardly and with more and more ease. Young Barty said he had talked with James that afternoon on Castleford Market, and now Tom remembered hearing of this young man at one of the friends of Melbourne's cousins. They had all been at school together in Castleford. Soon, very naturally, Hattie and young Barty were talking of skating. Young Barty admired Hattie's achievement that day. He had done as much himself, certainly, this very winter, but few ladies had skated so far. His own mother had done so. He remembered the tale of it. Years ago, when old Barty and she had been courting, there had been one of the same widespread hard frosts. The two of them had gone skating together from Castleford to Ely and then to Littleport and beyond. They had skated so far and so long that the young woman had nearly fallen asleep as she skated, and she'd half dreamed that she and her sweetheart had reached the sea and were skating over the smooth-out, frozen waves off to far-off countries. He and Hattie laughed over that. Then young Barty began to speak of the prospects of further skating, that winter and the next winter. He loved skating as Hattie did. Tom found the conversation uninteresting, chiefly because he could not join in with it. He was also cross with Hattie. She was behaving as if she either did not remember him or did not see him, or both. Several times a gesture of her hand accidentally passed through him. Once she learnt... Oh, little cat is making an appearance. Once she leant her arm along the back of the giant gig as she turned the better to listen to young Barty, and then her twist... Once she leant her arm along the back of the gig seat as she turned the better to listen to young Barty, and then her wrist and hand rested in Tom's gullet and made his swallows feel strange. He was glad when they reached Castleford railway station. The last train had not gone, but there was a long time to wait for it. Young Barty said it would be much better to drive home the last 5 miles, and Hattie did not object. Tom did, but he could not argue. He had been hoping for an empty railway compartment for that long private exploratory talk with Hattie. He must have it soon. The gig drove on. Tom sat alone in his thoughts while the other two talked over him or through him with an increasing delight in each other's company. A village church clock struck across the darkened countryside, and Tom thought of time, how he had been sure of mastering it and exchanging his own time for an eternity of Hattie's, and so of living pleasurably in the garden forever. The garden was still there, but meanwhile Hattie's time had stolen a march of him, and had turned Hattie herself from playmate into a grown-up woman. What Peter had seen was true. Through the clattering of the horse hooves, Tom listened to Hattie and young Barty. Theirs was grown-up conversation, and had no interest for him, and his own thoughts displeased him. Gradually his mind fell into vacancy. He was not tired by the skating, nor he was sleepy because of the lateness of the hour, yet he slept. Perhaps the monotony of the horse hooves has something to do with it, but perhaps a strange feeling that he was not in Hattie's thoughts any longer made him feel less awake and less alive. Dimly he felt the swing of the gig as it turned the corner by the whitewashed cottage and started down the lane to the big house. When Mrs. Melbourne, coldly amazed and angry, came to the front door to receive them, she saw only 2 people in the gig. That was to be expected. But even Hattie saw only one other beside herself, and that was young Barty. And that is the end of chapter 24. So the next chapter, chapter 25, is Last Chance. Bye everyone, hope you have a good day.